This is a true story, something that happened to me a few years back. I don't tell it often because revisiting that level of darkness isn't something you do lightly, but sometimes you have to remember the fire you walked through just to appreciate the peace on the other side. The crystal water goblet felt impossibly heavy in my hand, its faceted sides reflecting the grotesque, twinkling cheer of the Christmas lights strung across the mahogany sideboard. My ex-husband, Mark, raised his own glass from the head of the table, his teeth a predatory white against his Californian tan. "To a year of upgrades," he declared, his eyes flicking to me for a fraction of a second, just long enough to ensure the barb landed. "And to cutting out the dead weight holding you back." A wave of sycophantic laughter rippled through his family as they clinked their glasses against his. The sound like shattering ice in the warm, suffocating dining room of his mother's Lincoln Park mansion. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. The dead weight. That was me. It had been 6 months since the divorce was finalized, a brutal, lightning-fast affair that had left me legally and financially eviscerated. And here I was, honoring a stupid, decade-long tradition of Christmas Eve dinner at my former mother-in-law's home. Eleanor had insisted, her voice dripping with the false sweetness of a saccharine poison. "Oh, Sarah, dear, you're still family," she'd cooed over the phone. "We simply wouldn't feel right without you." I knew it was a lie. It was a command performance. I was the ghost of Christmas past, summoned to be a living testament to Mark's glorious present. My chair felt too small, the damask tablecloth abrasive against my wrists. Across the table, Mark's new fiancée, Tiffany, preened. She was a decade younger than me, a vapidly beautiful Instagram model whose primary contribution to any conversation was a breathy, "Oh wow," or a strategically timed giggle. She was wearing a crimson dress that was probably worth more than my entire wardrobe, and on her left hand, a diamond the size of a pigeon's egg glittered with malevolent fire. Every few minutes, she would angle her hand just so, catching the light from the chandelier, a silent, constant reminder of my replacement. She was the upgrade. The dinner was a masterclass in psychological torture. Every story was a veiled insult, every compliment a backhanded slap. My former sister-in-law, Chloe, gushed about Mark and Tiffany's recent trip to Bali. "The photos were just divine, Mark. You both look so unburdened." Mark's father, a portly man named Richard with a voice that boomed with undeserved authority, clapped his son on the back. "That's my boy. Always trading up. In business, in life, you've got the instinct, son." I focused on my plate, pushing a single roasted carrot around with my fork. The food, catered from some Michelin-starred restaurant in the West Loop, tasted like ash in my mouth. I remembered the Christmases when I had cooked in this very kitchen, spending days preparing my grandmother's recipes. Mark had loved my beef Wellington. He'd called it our tradition. Now, a stranger's professionally prepared version sat untouched on my plate. "So, Sarah," Chloe said, her voice sharp and unnaturally loud, cutting through the low hum of conversation. "What did you get for Christmas this year?" The table fell silent. All eyes turned to me. It wasn't a question, it was an execution. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, a flush of pure, unadulterated humiliation. I had nothing. My tiny, rented apartment in Wicker Park was bare, save for a small, sad-looking poinsettia I'd bought at Jewelosco. I was working a dead-end contract job at a small architecture firm, barely making enough to cover my bills, and the mountain of legal debt Mark's lawyers had buried me under. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, a polite deflection, a weak joke, but Mark beat me to it. He leaned back in his chair, a smug, cruel smile playing on his lips. He took a slow sip of his Cabernet, then set the glass down with a theatrical clink. "A bill from her lawyer, I imagine," he said, his voice laced with a performer's perfect timing. The table erupted. Not just chuckles, but deep, belly-shaking laughter. Richard roared, slapping the table so hard the silverware jumped. Eleanor let out a high, piercing titter, covering her mouth with a napkin as if to hide her unladylike glee. Tiffany giggled, the sound empty and shrill, as she squeezed Mark's arm in adoration. They were laughing at my pain, at my poverty, at my fall from grace. They were feasting on my failure. In that moment, something inside me shifted. The hurt, the grief, the despair that had been my constant companions for the better part of a year didn't vanish. Instead, they crystallized. They compressed under the immense pressure of that public humiliation and forged into something new. Something hard and cold and sharp. I looked at Mark's smiling face, at the smug satisfaction in his eyes, and I felt not sadness but a sudden, terrifying clarity. He hadn't just left me. He had orchestrated my destruction. And he was enjoying it. The laughter finally died down, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. I slowly raised my eyes from my plate and met his gaze across the table. He was still smiling, waiting for me to cry or run from the room, to give him the final act of his little play. I did neither. I held his gaze, and for the first time, I let him see the ice that had formed where my heart used to be. I didn't say a word. I simply picked up my wine glass, took a steady, deliberate sip of the bitter red wine, and began to plan. The drive back to my apartment was a blur of streetlights and silent fury. The laughter from that dining room echoed in my ears, a cruel soundtrack to the montage of my life's collapse. Mark and I had been the golden couple. We met at Northwestern, me in the architecture program, him in business school. We were inseparable, two halves of one ambitious whole. We married a year after graduation, our future a wide, sunlit avenue. Our dream was a shared one, to build a company that would revolutionize urban living. We called it Aura Homes. It was my baby, really. My thesis project had been on sustainable, modular, high-density housing that didn't feel like living in a shoebox. I poured years into the concept, designing flexible living pods, communal green spaces integrated into the structure, and a proprietary system for using reclaimed materials that was both cost-effective and beautiful. Mark was supposed to be the business brain. He was the one who would take my vision and sell it to the world. We spent countless nights hunched over our dining room table in our Lincoln Park condo, me sketching and running models on my computer, him building financial projections and business plans. My name, my ideas, my soul were woven into the DNA of Aura Homes. Then, about 2 years ago, things started to change. Mark became distant, secretive. He started taking meetings I wasn't invited to, citing boring investor stuff he didn't want to trouble me with. He insisted we create a new LLC for the business, putting it solely in his name for tax purposes and liability, he'd said, assuring me it was just a formality. I was a creator, not a businesswoman, he'd told me gently. I should focus on the designs. Trusting him, I did. That was my first catastrophic mistake. The final year was a slow, agonizing bleed. He was cold, critical, and constantly traveling for business. Then came Tiffany. I found a receipt for a suite at the Peninsula Hotel, a place we'd stayed for our anniversary, dated on a night he was supposedly in San Francisco. When I confronted him, there was no apology, no denial. Just a cold, flat statement. "It's over, Sarah. I want a divorce." The legal battle was a blitzkrieg. He had David Rosen, a shark from one of Chicago's most ruthless firms, Kirkland & Ellis. I had a public interest lawyer I could barely afford. Mark claimed the business, our business, was worthless, just a concept with no assets. He produced doctored financial statements showing our joint accounts had been drained by preliminary R&D costs. He argued that my design work was an unpaid hobby, and that Aura Homes, the company he had in his name, held no tangible value. He offered me a pittance of a settlement and threatened to drag the proceedings out for years, bankrupting me in the process if I didn't sign. I was broken, exhausted, and utterly blindsided. I signed. 2 weeks after the divorce was final, he announced the launch of Apex Living, his new real estate development company. The press release was nauseating. It hailed Mark as a visionary entrepreneur, set to reshape Chicago's skyline. His flagship project? A revolutionary sustainable urban housing development. My blood ran cold. It was Aura Homes. It was my work. He had stolen it. He had stripped our marriage for parts, taken my life's work, and slapped a new name on it. Tiffany was listed on the company's board as a brand ambassador. Back in my tiny apartment, the rage from the dinner party gave way to a steely resolve. The humiliation had been a gift. It had burned away the last vestiges of the grieving, victimized woman I had become. Mark thought I was dead weight. He thought I was a joke. He was about to find out how wrong he was. My crusade began not with a bang, but with the quiet click of a mouse in the dead of night. Fueled by stale coffee and a burning sense of injustice, I turned my small living room into a war room. I started with public records, city permits, and corporate filings. It was all there, a digital breadcrumb trail of his betrayal. The incorporation date for Apex Living was 3 months before he'd asked for a divorce. He had been building his escape raft while I was still trying to patch the holes in our sinking ship. I found the patent filings. Reading them felt like a physical violation. He had taken my designs, my modular pod system, my specific schematics for rainwater collection and greywater recycling, and filed them under his name. He'd made minor cosmetic changes, just enough to be legally distinct if you weren't the one who had birthed the idea. But I could see my own hand in every line, every angle. I printed out one of the diagrams, a cross-section of the communal atrium, and held it next to one of my original sketches from an old hard drive. They were identical. He hadn't even bothered to be clever about his theft. It was the work of an arrogant man who believed he had so thoroughly crushed his victim that she would never have the strength to fight back. The news articles were the worst. Forbes, Crane's Chicago Business, the Tribune. They all fawned over him. Mark Hemlock, the wunderkind developer changing how we live. There were pictures of him and Tiffany at black tie galas, clinking champagne glasses with aldermen and city planners. They quoted him talking about his vision, his passion for sustainable design. In one interview, he actually said, "The idea for Apex Living came to me in a flash of inspiration one night. I just knew I had to create communities, not just buildings." I almost threw my laptop across the room. He was a parasite, and he was wearing my skin as a suit. His power seemed absolute. He had money, connections, a glowing public profile, and a team of expensive lawyers. I had a dusty portfolio of old drawings and a negative bank balance. The system was on his side. The world was on his side. They had already crowned him king. Any attempt to challenge him would look like the bitter ramblings of a scorned ex-wife. He had built his fortress on that very assumption. For weeks I spiraled. The sheer scale of his betrayal felt insurmountable. How could I, with nothing, fight a man who had everything? I'd spend my days at my drafting job, feeling like an imposter, and my nights falling down internet rabbit holes, each new discovery of his success another twist of the knife. He was breaking ground on the first Apex Living tower in the South Loop. There were billboards along the Kennedy Expressway with his smug face next to Tiffany's, their perfect smiles beaming down on the city he was conning. The turning point came on a miserable, rainy Tuesday in February. I was on the L train, heading home from work, feeling beaten down and hopeless. The train screeched to a halt between stations, and I found myself staring directly at one of those billboards. Mark and Tiffany, 10 feet tall, under the slogan, "Apex Living, the future is here." The future he stole from me. People in the train car were commuting home, tired, anonymous, just trying to get by. And there he was, a monument to a lie built on my back. And that's when the despair finally burned out, leaving nothing but cold, hard rage. It wasn't just about the money or the credit anymore. It was about the truth. He had erased me from my own life story. He had taken my voice. And I decided right there in that rattling, stalled train car that I was going to take it back. I would not be the dead weight. I would not be the lawyer's bill. I would be the architect of his ruin. The train lurched forward, and as the billboard slid from view, I took out my phone and made my first call. I didn't know if he would even remember me, but I had to try. I was looking for a ghost of Mark's past, a man I hoped was just as hungry for vengeance as I was. His name was David Chun. David Chun had been Mark's first partner, right out of business school. They'd started a small tech logistics company together. A year in, Mark had pushed him out, using some legal loophole in their partnership agreement to dissolve the company and immediately reopen it under a new name with all of their clients, leaving David with nothing. I'd always felt a quiet sympathy for him, but Mark had been so convincing, painting David as incompetent and lazy. Now I saw the pattern. I found David on LinkedIn. He was now a mid-level manager at a shipping firm in Naperville, a shadow of the ambitious entrepreneur I remembered. I sent him a message, brief and to the point. I think you and I have a mutual friend in Mark Hemlock. I'm his ex-wife. I believe he did to me what he did to you. I have a proposition. He responded within the hour. We met at a nondescript coffee shop in the Loop. David was wary at first, his eyes shadowed with old bitterness. But as I laid out my story, showing him the side-by-side comparisons of my designs and Mark's patents, I saw a flicker of recognition, of grim understanding. That's his move, he said, his voice low and tight. He lets you do all the work, build the entire thing, then right when it's about to become valuable, he cuts you out and takes everything. He did it with our client routing algorithm. I wrote 90% of the code. The alliance was forged over lukewarm coffee and a shared desire for retribution. David was my first real asset. He no longer had a legal claim against Mark. The statute of limitations had long passed, but he had something just as valuable: knowledge of his playbook. And he had emails. Old, saved emails from their fallout, where Mark had inadvertently admitted to his strategy. It's not about who has the idea, Dave. One of them read. It's about who crosses the finish line first. That email was a gem. It established a pattern of behavior. David's next contribution was even more critical. You can't fight him with your public defender, he said, shaking his head. You need a monster. You need someone who hates men like Mark more than you do. He slid a business card across the table. On it were 3 words: Jessica Riley, attorney at law. Jessica Riley's office was on the 40th floor of a sleek skyscraper on Wacker Drive, with a panoramic view of the Chicago River. The office itself was minimalist, almost sterile. Concrete floors, glass walls, a single black orchid on a steel desk. Jessica was the same. She was a tall, sharp woman in her late 40s with a severe black bob and eyes that didn't just see you, they scanned you for weaknesses. She had a reputation as a stone-cold killer in intellectual property law, and she took a special, vicious pleasure in eviscerating corporate bullies. She listened to my story without interruption, her face an unreadable mask. I spread my documents across her enormous glass conference table. My original dated sketches, the digital timestamps on my C80 files, Mark's patent applications, the news articles, the damning email David had given me. When I finished, she was silent for a full minute, her fingers steepled under her chin as she stared at the evidence. He's arrogant, she finally said, her voice a low, precise hum. He didn't cover his tracks because he never imagined anyone would come looking for them. He sees you as a domestic loose end, not a business threat. She tapped a manicured finger on the side-by-side design comparison. This is blatant. The question isn't whether you have a case. The question is how much damage you want to do. I looked out the window at the city Mark thought he owned. I want to burn it all down, I said, my voice quiet but steady. A slow, cold smile spread across Jessica's face. I'll take the case on contingency, she said. My fee will be 40% of whatever we recover. And believe me, Ms. Evans, we will recover. The war began. Jessica filed a lawsuit that hit Mark like a freight train. Intellectual property theft, fraud, breach of fiduciary duty. We weren't just asking for damages. We were filing an injunction to halt all construction on the Apex Living project, and we were challenging the validity of his patents. It was a declaration of total war. Mark's response was predictable. His lawyer, David Rosen, filed a motion to dismiss, calling the lawsuit a frivolous and vindictive fantasy concocted by a bitter ex-wife. They painted me as unstable, a failed architect trying to cash in on her ex-husband's genius. This was the fight he was prepared for, the one he thought he could easily win in the court of public opinion. But he wasn't prepared for Jessica. Jessica was a master strategist. While Rosen was busy trying to get the case thrown out, we were digging. We hired a forensic accountant, a quiet, unassuming man named Arthur who had a bloodhound's nose for hidden money. Arthur spent weeks combing through the financials Mark had been forced to produce during discovery. He unraveled a complex web of shell corporations and offshore accounts. It turned out Mark hadn't just drained our joint accounts for R&D. He had been systematically laundering money for months, siphoning it into the new company, a clear case of fraudulent conveyance designed to hide assets from the divorce settlement. My job was to be the archivist of my own life. I spent hundreds of hours sifting through old hard drives, cloud backups, and email accounts. The eureka moment came at 3 a.m. one morning, fueled by my fourth cup of coffee. I found it buried in an old iMessage backup, a video file from 3 years prior. It was a screen recording of a video call I'd had with a specialty building materials supplier in Germany. On the call, I was enthusiastically walking their engineers through my entire Aura Homes concept, sharing my screen to show them my detailed schematics, and explaining my proprietary reclaimed materials process. And on that call, visible in a small window in the corner, was Mark, silently listening. The video was time-stamped May 14, 2022. The date Mark claimed in his deposition to have had his flash of inspiration was December 1, 2022. It was the smoking gun, a digital ghost from the past, ready to testify on my behalf. When Jessica presented this video during Mark's second deposition, the change in the room was palpable. David Rosen's face went pale. Mark, for the first time, lost his composure. He stammered, contradicted himself, and dug his own grave deeper with every word. He had perjured himself, and we had him dead to rights. The legal battle raged on for months. It was a grueling war of attrition, filled with motions, hearings, and endless paperwork. Mark and his family, especially Eleanor, tried to fight me in the press. They leaked sanitized, out-of-context emails to gossip columnists, painting me as jealous and unhinged. There were days I wanted to give up. The public scrutiny was brutal, and my finances were stretched to the breaking point. But then I would look at the photo of Mark and Tiffany laughing at that Christmas dinner, and the fire would return. Slowly, the tide began to turn. The judge denied Rosen's motion to dismiss. He granted our injunction, and the cranes at the massive South Loop construction site ground to a halt. The financial world started to notice. Mark's investors grew nervous. The positive press dried up, replaced by cautious articles about the contentious lawsuit and allegations of fraud plaguing Apex living. Jessica was relentless. She was a shark that had tasted blood. She used the evidence of financial fraud to get the U.S. Attorney's Office interested. What started as a civil suit was now threatening to become a federal criminal investigation. Mark was trapped. His lies were catching up to him. The fortress he had built was beginning to crumble, and he was running out of places to hide. As the leaves began to turn in Chicago, signaling the approach of another holiday season, Jessica secured the final piece of her plan. She called me into her office. "He wants to settle," she said, looking out at the city skyline. "He's offering a substantial amount. Enough to make you very comfortable." I thought about it for a moment. I could take the money, and the fight, and walk away. I could be free. But it wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about justice. It was about that Christmas dinner. "No," I said. "It's not enough. I don't just want him to pay me. I want him to be exposed. I want everyone to know exactly who and what he is." Jessica's cold smile returned. "Good," she said, "because I've arranged for the final hearing to be on December 21st. And I've already spoken to a reporter at the Tribune. She's very interested in our story." She paused, then added, "By the way, I got you an invitation." She slid a heavy cream-colored envelope across the desk. It was an invitation to the Hemlock family's annual Christmas Eve dinner. It had been sent by Chloe along with a short, stilted note about putting the past behind us. "They don't know," I said, a slow realization dawning on me. "They have no idea how bad it is for him." "None at all," Jessica confirmed. "He's been lying to them, telling them it's just a nuisance suit he's about to win. They think you're coming to beg. Let's not disappoint them." The year had transformed me. The woman who walked into Eleanor Hemlock's Lincoln Park mansion that Christmas Eve was not the same one who had fled in shame a year prior. I was no longer the dead weight. I was the iceberg. I wore a simple, elegant black dress, but the most important part of my ensemble was on my left hand. It was an engagement ring. It wasn't large or ostentatious like Tiffany's, but a beautiful, understated sapphire surrounded by small diamonds. It was from a wonderful man named Alex, a landscape architect I'd met through a mutual friend months ago. He was kind and brilliant, and he saw me for who I was, not what he could take from me. He knew the whole story, and he was waiting for me at a reservation he'd made at Alinea, ready to celebrate the end of a war. The ring wasn't just a symbol of new love. It was a symbol of my new life, a life I had built myself from the ashes of the old one. When the butler opened the door, a hush fell over the foyer. Mark, Eleanor, Tiffany, and the rest of the family were gathered, glasses of champagne in hand. Their faces were a mixture of shock and contempt. They had expected me to arrive looking broken, defeated. They saw a woman who looked serene, confident, and, for lack of a better word, victorious. Eleanor was the first to speak, her voice tight with disapproval. "Sarah, what a surprise. We weren't sure you'd have the nerve to show your face." "Hello, Eleanor," I said calmly. I wouldn't miss it for the world. My eyes found Mark's. He looked tired. The strain of the last year was visible in the lines around his eyes. But the arrogance was still there, simmering just below the surface. He glanced at my hand, saw the ring, and a flicker of something, surprise? Jealousy? Crossed his face before he masked it with a sneer. "Well, well," he said. "Looks like you landed on your feet. Who's the unlucky guy?" Dinner was an exercise in extreme tension. The air was thick with unspoken hostility. They tried to ignore me, launching into loud, forced conversations about ski trips to Aspen and the new spring collection from Dior. They were performing their wealth, their status, their impenetrable family unity. They were a pack of wolves, trying to pretend the huntress in their midst was just a lost sheep. Finally, after the main course was cleared, Mark stood, glass in hand, to propose a toast. It was a repeat performance of the year before, a testament to his staggering lack of imagination. "To family," he began, his eyes sweeping the table, pointedly skipping over me. "And to success. To building things that last. To knowing what you want and taking it." As he raised his glass, I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. The simple act of me standing commanded the room's attention. "I have a toast I'd like to make as well," I said, my voice clear and steady. Mark lowered his glass, his eyes narrowing. "Sit down, Sarah. You're making a scene." "No," I said, looking directly at him. "You're the one who's been making a scene for the past 2 years. I'm just here to provide the final act." I picked up my water goblet. "I'd like to toast to the truth. And to intellectual property." A confused murmur went around the table. I had their full attention. "You see," I continued, my gaze never leaving Mark's, "you talk about building things that last. But you can't build anything lasting on a foundation of lies. You didn't build Apex Living, Mark." "I did. You just stole the blueprints." Eleanor gasped. "How dare you? My son is a visionary." "Your son is a thief," I said, my voice as cold and sharp as broken glass. "He stole my designs, my financials, my entire business plan while we were still married. He patented my work as his own, and built his empire with money he fraudulently hid from our divorce. He committed perjury in a federal deposition. And the whole thing is about to come crashing down." Mark laughed, a hollow, desperate sound. "You're insane. You have no proof." "Oh, but I do," I said. "I have the original files with digital timestamps predating your flash of inspiration by more than a year. I have the video of our call with the German suppliers where I explained my entire system to you. I have the forensic accountant's report tracing every single dollar you stole. And as of yesterday, the U.S. Attorney's Office has all of it, too." The color drained from his face. For the first time, he looked truly afraid. At that exact moment, the grand front door of the mansion opened. A man in a simple dark suit stepped into the dining room. He wasn't the butler. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on Mark. "Mark Hemlock?" the man asked, his voice polite but firm. Mark stared at him, speechless. "I'm a process server," the man said, stepping forward and placing a thick legal envelope on the pristine white tablecloth next to Mark's plate. You've been served. As if on cue, a series of notifications pinged on phones all around the table. Chloe was the first to look at hers. Her eyes went wide. "Oh my God," she whispered. The Tribune. The headline of the article that had just gone live read, "Chicago's apex of fraud. Developer Mark Hemlock sued for millions, accused of stealing company from ex-wife, federal investigation pending." The room was silent, save for the frantic tapping of fingers on screens as everyone read the damning, meticulously detailed exposé. The story laid out everything: the stolen designs, the hidden assets, the perjury. It was all there in black and white for the entire city to see. Tiffany stared at Mark, her face a mask of horror and disbelief. The pigeon egg diamond on her finger suddenly seemed like nothing more than a shard of glass. She was beginning to understand that the man she'd attached herself to was not a king, but a con man, and his kingdom was made of paper. Eleanor looked from the phone in her hand to me, her face contorted with a rage that was quickly being eclipsed by fear. The public humiliation, the scandal, it was the one thing their money couldn't protect them from. I looked at Mark one last time. He was no longer a titan of industry. He was just a small, frightened man, exposed in front of his family, his world collapsing in real time. He had lost his company, his reputation, and his freedom was hanging by a thread. I had taken everything from him, just as he had done to me. But I had done it with the one thing he never valued: the truth. I placed my napkin on the table, turned without another word, and walked out of the dining room, leaving the wreckage of his life smoldering behind me. He had stolen my work, my money, and my past, but as the first snowflakes of Christmas began to fall on the cold Chicago streets, I realized I had finally taken back my name. The end.